Every choice Dexter Morgan made led to tragedy. He thought he could live in two worlds, one as a loving brother, father, and forensic expert, the other as a cold-blooded killer who followed his own twisted sense of justice. But in the end, he lost everything. One by one, the people he loved were ripped away. His brother, his wife, his sister, and finally, his own son turned against him. Was this karma? Was Dexter doomed from the start? Today, we break down the most tragic episodes that completely destroyed his world. The moments that proved there was no escaping who he really was. If you had a brother, someone who truly understood you, someone who accepted your darkest urges without judgment, would you ever let him go? For Dexter, that choice was never truly his to make. The moment he discovered Brian Moser was his biological brother,
I have a brother. A real brother.
It should have been a revelation, a moment of joy, of long-lost family found. But instead, it became a tragedy written in blood, because Brian wasn't just a long-lost sibling. He was the ice truck killer, the man Dexter had been hunting all season. And yet, was Brian really a villain in Dexter's story? Or was he simply a mirror, a version of Dexter that had grown up without a Harry Morgan to shape him? Brian never had a code, never had a father figure drilling rules into his mind, telling him which kills were righteous and which weren't. He was raw, unfiltered, exactly what Dexter could have been if he had never been trained to blend in. And for Brian, that was what made them perfect for each other. I thought we'd be together forever. That was Brian's last whisper before Dexter took his life. But what if Dexter had chosen differently? What if instead of following Harry's code, he had embraced Brian's vision of brotherhood? Would the world have been worse off? Or would Dexter have finally been free? Free from the constant weight of pretending, of forcing himself into a life that never truly fit? This moment is one of the most tragic in the series because, for the first time, Dexter had the chance to be understood, to not be alone. Brian didn't judge him. He didn't force Dexter to be someone he wasn't. In Brian's eyes, they weren't monsters. They were superior. The world was their hunting ground, and they were meant to hunt together. But Dexter rejected that. He chose the illusion of morality over the one person who actually saw him for what he was. And yet, the irony is that Brian never truly left him. Throughout the series, Brian returns, not physically, but psychologically. In some of Dexter's darkest moments, his brother's voice echoes in his mind, taunting him, reminding him that no matter how much he tries to suppress it, he is not normal, that he never was, that he never will be. So did Dexter make the right choice? Because as we'll soon see, this was only the beginning. If he thought losing Brian was painful, he had no idea what was coming. Dexter spent years believing he could live a normal life, that he could be a loving husband and father while still feeding his dark passenger. And in the end, that illusion cost him everything. He thought he had won. Trinity was dead. His family was safe. But when he returned home, the world as he knew it was shattered. Rita, lifeless, in their bathtub. And in the most brutal twist of fate, baby Harrison was sitting there, covered in blood, just like Dexter was the night his mother died. Was this karma? For years, Dexter convinced himself that he wasn't a monster, that he could kill and still have a normal life, that he could be a husband, a father, a protector, all while keeping his addiction to bloodshed separate. But Trinity had proven him wrong in the worst way possible. And here's the part that haunts Dexter forever. This wasn't just a loss. It was a cycle repeating itself. Harrison would grow up exactly like Dexter did, traumatized, shaped by blood. The very thing Dexter swore would never happen, and the cruelest irony, he didn't even realize it at the time. When he looked at Harrison in that moment, he didn't think, I have to stop this cycle. He thought, I have to keep going, because that's who Dexter was. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even a man trying to redeem himself. He was someone who, at his core, believed that his world could continue as it was, that he could keep his two lives separate. But Trinity showed him the truth. There is no normal for someone like Dexter. And the most chilling part? Rita's death wasn't even necessary. Trinity didn't kill her out of rage, or because he had to. He did it because he wanted Dexter to feel what it was like to lose everything. And in that sense, Trinity was the one killer who actually won, because no matter how much Dexter tried to suppress it, this was the moment that sealed his fate. Not just because of the loss of Rita, but because of what it meant for Harrison. Dexter should have walked away right then. He should have realized that this was the consequence of his double life. But he didn't. He kept going, and his next tragedy was right around the corner. Dexter had very few people in his life who ever saw him as anything but a killer. But brother Sam? He believed in redemption. He believed Dexter could change. And maybe, for a second, Dexter did too. Brother Sam wasn't like the others. He wasn't a cop trying to catch Dexter, a killer trying to outsmart him, or a victim begging for their life. He was one of the rare people who looked at Dexter and saw something more than just the dark passenger. He saw a man who could choose a different path. But was that ever really possible? As Brother Sam lay in that hospital bed, his body weak, his voice fading, he gave Dexter a choice. He begged him to forgive his killer, to let go of his anger, to be more than just a man who takes lives. But Dexter couldn't. Because at his core, Dexter wasn't built for forgiveness. He wasn't wired for mercy. He had spent his entire life justifying his actions with the code, believing that justice came from the blade, not from understanding. And that's why Brother Sam's death was so important. This wasn't just another loss. This was a test. What would Dexter do when faced with someone who had faith in him? Would he prove Brother Sam right? Would he take a different path? Would he finally be more than just the monster Harry had shaped him into? No, Dexter chose revenge. He tracked down Nick, the man who killed Brother Sam, and instead of offering forgiveness, he did what he had always done. He killed. And in that moment, something inside him broke, because deep down, he knew the truth. He had failed, not just Brother Sam, but himself. For a brief moment, Dexter had hope that he could be more than just a killer. But hope is dangerous. Hope is what makes you think you can outrun fate. Brother Sam believed in Dexter, but Dexter proved that faith was misplaced. Special Agent Frank Lundy was one of the smartest men to ever cross Dexter's path. Unlike LaGuerta or Dokes, he never suspected Dexter. But maybe that's because he saw something else, something even more dangerous. Lundy had a different kind of obsession. While Miami Metro was always chasing after the killers that left behind obvious trails, Lundy had a sixth sense for the ones that slipped through the cracks. He didn't waste time on petty criminals. He hunted the worst of the worst, the predators who thought they were untouchable. And he was right about Trinity. But intelligence doesn't always mean survival. Lundy's biggest weakness? He didn't think of himself as vulnerable. He was meticulous, methodical, always one step ahead. But even the smartest hunter can become the hunted. He got too close. And just like that, in a single moment, he was gone. His sudden death wasn't just a tragedy for Debra. It was a warning sign. Debra had always seen Lundy as the one stable figure in her chaotic life. He was the voice of reason, the man who taught her how to trust her instincts, how to be a better cop. Losing him broke her. But Dexter should have seen what this meant. If someone as sharp as Lundy could be taken out so easily, what did that say about the world Dexter lived in? That no one was safe? That the more he tried to balance his two lives, the more people around him would suffer? Lundy's death should have been the moment Dexter realized that being in the orbit of a serial killer, even one with a code, was a death sentence. And yet, he ignored it. He kept letting Debra get closer, kept pretending that she could somehow exist in his world without consequences. But the truth is, this was the first step in Debra's downfall. Because if Lundy's death shattered her, what happened next would destroy her completely. You remember that moment. The gun shaking in her hands, the tears in her eyes, LaGuerta lying there, begging Debra to do the right thing. And then, bang, that was the moment Debra lost herself. The moment Dexter's world shattered completely. It's easy to forget just how much Debra sacrificed for Dexter. She had spent her entire life chasing justice, trying to prove she was more than just Harry's daughter or Dexter's little sister. And yet, in the end, she became the very thing she swore she would never be, a murderer. And the worst part? She did it for him, not for justice. Not because she wanted to, but because Dexter had put her in a position where she felt like there was no other way. And that's the real tragedy of this moment. For years, Dexter believed that his double life only affected himself, that as long as he was careful, as long as he followed the code, he could have his secret world without hurting the people he loved. But this was the undeniable proof that he was wrong, because LaGuerta wasn't just some random detective who got too close. She was someone who was right. She figured it out. She saw through Dexter in a way no one else at Miami Metro ever had. And what did that get her? A bullet to the chest. Not because she was dangerous, not because she deserved it, but because Dexter's existence demanded it. And in that moment, Debra sealed her fate. Before this, there was still a path back for her. She could have had a normal life. She could have walked away from Dexter, cut ties, moved on. But after this, there was no going back. She had crossed the line. And Dexter knew it too. Because when he looked at Debra after that gunshot, he didn't just see his sister, he saw himself. This was the moment Debra became just like him. And the universe? It wasn't going to let that go unanswered. Because the next tragedy? It was going to be the final one. It was poetic in the worst way. The person who saved Dexter, the only one who ever truly loved him, was the one who suffered the most. She was his hero. She fought for him when no one else would. She stood by him, protected him, loved him unconditionally, even when it went against everything she believed in. And yet, in the end, she was the one who paid the ultimate price. Debra Morgan, the woman who had spent her entire life chasing justice, who clawed her way up the ranks of Miami Metro to prove she was more than just Harry Morgan's daughter, died because of him. And Dexter, he couldn't save her. Not when she was spiraling into self-destruction after killing LaGuerta. Not when she drowned herself in guilt, desperately trying to undo the damage he had caused. And certainly not when she lay in that hospital bed, brain dead, robbed of the fiery, relentless spirit that had defined her entire existence. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He pulled the plug himself. And in that moment, Dexter wasn't just killing Debra. He was killing the last piece of himself that was ever capable of love. Because after everything, after all the blood, the lies, the destruction, Debra was the only thing tethering him to humanity. She was the last person who saw the good in him, who believed there was something in him worth saving. And now, she was gone. There was no more Dexter Morgan. Not really. The man he once pretended to be, the loving brother, the father, the protector. He had died along with Debra. But even that wasn't enough, because Dexter had one last ritual to complete. He carried Debra's lifeless body out of the hospital, and as the storm raged around him, he took her out to sea, the same waters where he had dumped his victims, the same ocean that had swallowed the bodies of the men and women he had decided deserved to die. But this time, it wasn't a monster he was disposing of, it was his sister. As he let her slip beneath the waves, there was no ceremony, no last words, no poetic justification for what he had done, just silence. A moment that stretched endlessly, as if even the ocean itself was mourning what had been lost. And then, just like that, he was gone. Or so we thought. Because as much as Dexter wanted to believe he could outrun the consequences of his life, fate had other plans. He may have escaped the storm that night, sailing into oblivion, but karma wasn't finished with him yet. Because years later, in the icy silence of Iron Lake, his past would come back for him. And this time, it would be his own son who pulled the trigger. Years later, when we saw Dexter again in New Blood, he was just a shell of the man he used to be. No family, no love, no purpose. Just a lonely killer hiding from his past, tucked away in the frozen wasteland of Iron Lake. For the first time in his life, Dexter wasn't playing a role. He wasn't pretending to be the perfect family man, the charming co-worker, the devoted brother. He had stripped himself down to nothing. He had abandoned the very idea of Dexter Morgan. But the past never lets you go. Because just when he thought he could disappear for good, Harrison walked back into his life. And suddenly, Dexter had something to lose again. But the irony? The thing he wanted to protect more than anything, his son, was the very thing that would destroy him. Because Harrison wasn't like Dexter. He wasn't born into this darkness. He wasn't shaped by a code, trained to kill, conditioned to suppress his emotions. He was still human. And when the truth about Dexter finally came to light, he made the one choice Dexter never could. He pulled the trigger. And just like that, Dexter Morgan was gone. But was this justice? For years, Dexter convinced himself that he wasn't like other killers, that he only took the lives of those who deserved it, that he was in control. But in the end, the only thing his code ever did was prolong the inevitable. Because the truth is, Dexter was never meant to survive. From the moment he took his first life, he was already dead. Every person he ever loved, every person who ever believed in him, was either destroyed or left broken in his wake. Harrison was the final proof of that. Because in the end, Dexter wasn't the hero of this story. He was the villain. And maybe this was the only ending he ever deserved. From Brian to Rita, from Debra to Harrison. One by one, Dexter lost everyone who ever loved him. And in the end, it wasn't just because he was a serial killer. It wasn't just the bodies he left behind or the blood he spilled. It was because he believed he could have both worlds, a normal life and a dark passenger. That he could be a father, a brother, a friend, while still feeding the darkness inside him. But that was never possible. Every person who ever got close to Dexter either died, suffered, or was forced to become something they weren't. And maybe that was always going to be the case. Maybe there was never a way out. So now I ask you, was this fate? Was this karma? Or was Dexter always meant to end up alone? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.